Okay, super. Let's start our webinar. My name is Siarhei Liubimau. I'm working at the European Humanities University Laboratory of Critical Urbanism, and I will be moderating the event today. And during the event, we'll discuss the topic of polarized sustainable transport issues together with Scott Rodgers, who is reader in media and geography at the School of Creative Arts, Culture and Communication at Birkbeck, University of London. And the seminar's title is Localized Online Misinformation, Unpacking the Objects and Mediums of Polarized Sustainable Urban Transport Issues in London and the UK. We thought that the case itself allows a really great angle on digital media and contentious politics and contentious local politics or urban politics in particular, but also it's very much part, I mean, the approach Scott is taking, it's very much, let's say, in this momentum of thinking about fossil fuel and democracy, like a lot of very interesting approaches, arguments are being developed from this perspective. So we're super grateful that Scott agreed to join and to present his work, which is very much a work in progress. And Scott has suggested that he's very much looking forward to get feedback on this. So Scott, thank you very much again. And the floor is yours. Just a couple of sentences still about the format. We will be collecting questions both in the seminar room and on Zoom. Those on Zoom who would like to ask, please write on chat and we'll give you a floor. So Scott, thank you very much again, and we're very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Siarhei. I'll just share my screen. Okay, it's asking me to do something to share my sound, which we'll see if this works. If not, I'll just leave it. All right, let's cancel. I'll skip the sound sharing. So I'll just share my screen and hopefully we can get started. Does it all look okay, Siarhei? Except I have to go to the beginning again.
Yes, it's good. We don't see your notes.
Okay, good. I'll go to the beginning. So I can start now. Thank you very much, Siarhei, and also to the Laboratory of Critical Urbanism for the invitation to present on this research today. And my thanks to all of you for coming to hear me speak, particularly those of you who are in Vilnius, I guess, and experiencing, sounds like, snowy weather. And we just have cold weather here in London, and it's not snowy. But thanks for coming to hear me speak. I look forward to continuing the discussion in the second half of the hour, and hopefully you'll have some questions for me about any parts of the presentation. As I've been going to explain in a moment further, this presentation, in a way, both looks back and looks forward. And that's to say, it looks back at collaborative research that I actually undertook in 2018, just before the onset of COVID, but also research that I'm planning in the year ahead, this year, 2024. Now, the context for that looking back and forward at the same time are, for me, somewhat specific to the UK and to UK cities, but I think the issues that are being highlighted hopefully are not exclusively related to UK cities at all. But to bring it, I guess, initially to the UK, in the lead up to the upcoming London mayoral elections, which happen in May, and also the very likely UK general elections across the country, what we're seeing in the UK is the strong likelihood that sustainable transport policies are going to be mobilized as politicized, what are called wedge issues. So seemingly technical or sort of controversial policies, things like low traffic neighborhoods, Greater London's ultra low emission zone, ambitions for 15-minute cities, and so on, have become polarizing political issues. And even beyond that, they've been framed within the so-called culture wars, even made into the subject of conspiracy theories. And what I want to argue in this presentation is that if we want to make sense of what's going on in these kinds of contexts, we need to think about how different publics form around these kinds of urban sustainability interventions. And for me, this means two things. First, it means thinking about how publics often coalesce, or mainly coalesce, around very specific material interventions and issues. And that's what I mean by objects in the title of the presentation. And then secondly, it also means attending to the mediums through which these publics communicate about those sorts of issue or object-orientated controversies. And notably, I want to pay a bit of attention talking about to the medium of social media. So I'm going to be exploring these objects and mediums of polarized sustainable urban transport issues with reference to a sort of old case study initially. And this is the case study of the Mini Holland program of the London Borough of Waltham Forest. And I'm going to describe that in a second, but just briefly, it's a policy program that emerged prior to the rapid implementation of several similar types of initiatives across the UK, largely in response to the COVID-19 restrictions. And I'll detail a lot of that later. But this case study I'm about to talk about has actually been discussed and informed some of the research that I have listed on the screen. You'll notice it's mostly collaborative research, and I'm speaking to research that was mostly done collaboratively. But in a strange and maybe even slightly embarrassing way, it's only now that we're seeing more recent developments that I've mentioned, where these kinds of sustainable transport issues have cropped up as part of the so-called culture wars that have become the subject of conspiracy theories, that we've decided to come back to this research again, directly and more belatedly. So to start with that research that goes back to before COVID, I'd like to begin with a bit of a scene. Okay, so what you see in this image is a bit of an unusual site for Orford Road. And Orford Road is a generally pleasant and undeniably gentrified pocket of Walthamstow, East London. This is a shot from 2015. You can see a diverse group of protesters are on a march. Theatrically, some are carrying a coffin. They have megaphones. They have signs. One here, if you can read it in the background, says, "Don't get old, ill, or have a fire. No one can get to you." This protest is being staged against Mini Holland, which is a transportation scheme in the London Borough of Waltham Forest, within which Walthamstow sits. And the scheme was funded by Transport for London to the tune of £30 million. And its name, Mini Holland, was actually borrowed from the then mayor, Boris Johnson, who you'll probably know later became the Prime Minister of the UK. It was a program that involved making a series of significant changes to the borough's road infrastructure in order to enhance the environment for cyclists in particular, but also pedestrians. Now, the occasion here is the official opening of the scheme. And because of this, protesters and promoters are having a kind of unique face-to-face encounter. For one, protesters are confronting representatives, you can see there on the screen, hopefully, of the London Cycling Campaign, who were instrumental in pushing Waltham Forest Council to make a particularly ambitious funding application to Transport for London, which is the Metropolitan Transport Agency. Here, the protesters also follow council staff who are taking a Dutch delegate on a tour of the immediate area. It is called Mini Holland after all. They eventually catch up, and you can see that the visitor, the Dutch delegate, is making polite responses to their direct questions. This is now the council cabinet member who's responsible for environment in the borough. And by this point in the protest, he'd come to personify Mini Holland as a program. And you can see the protesters here sort of taking turns, one by one, haranguing him for his strong and often uncompromising promotion of the scheme, often on social media. Many are filming the encounter, including, you can see a guy in the background there. He has a GoPro attached to his forehead. And of course, the moving images I'm using here also are from some of the people filming the encounter. But at this protest, not everyone is a protester or a promoter in an overt sense. Some people are just sort of standing askance or looking kind of bemused. Many of the people clearly are less invested in what's going on. But at this point, we might ask a question. How has a transport scheme like this become controversial as an issue in the first place? Interestingly, if we look at this protest I'm showing you images from here, the protesters and promoters that were at the scene already knew each other, not because of interacting so much face-to-face like they are here at the protest, but actually because they've been participating in these locally anchored and orientated exchanges via social media platforms. And many of the bystanders, those people who were less involved in the protest, were also probably already aware, even if more vaguely, of the disquiet around this Mini Holland program. When you look at the videos, the more extensive clips as well, you can see that people are checking social media on the spot. Some are taking images or videos of the protest. So they too are kind of involved, even if it's in a more ambient, low-level kind of way. Now, if this protest pointed to a problem of participation, it wasn't that apparent to borough councillors and staff. Because from their point of view, the public consultations that had led up to the Mini Holland program had actually been a success. They had a much larger than average response rate, about 15%, which is considered a lot. They had set up information booths like the ones you see on the screen in outdoor public spaces. With the local cycling campaign, they'd run creative workshops. They'd, done these workshops with, multicolored Post-it notes, and they'd arranged them and rearranged them and discussed them, done lots of creative things. Waltham Forest Council had also been an earlier adopter of a dedicated digital platform called Commonplace, and that's produced by London-based developers. Commonplace is a platform designed specifically for gaining feedback on urban regeneration schemes. Feedback, as you can see, is geotagged. It includes emotional metrics as a key selling feature. So it's not just about people saying things they like and don't like, but also expressing kind of feelings about particular areas. And it creates heat maps and that kind of thing. The council politicians and staff, aside from doing all of these participatory exercises, had also expected the protest, though, because a month earlier, more than 300 people had gathered at the town hall where the council was voting on the scheme. And at the protest, many of the protesters were chanting "Labour out." And the detail here that's relevant is that this is a London borough, Waltham Forest, which has actually been dominated by the Labour Party for more than 30 years. Its parliamentary constituency in the area remains one of the safest Labour seats in the United Kingdom. It is represented by, then and now, by Stella Creasy, who in the UK is an outspoken MP, both in Parliament, but also very notably, she's outspoken on social media. So what was all the fuss about, right? Well, Mini Holland was, by UK standards at least, a quite ambitious cycling infrastructure project. It doesn't just involve building new fully separated cycling lanes, but more controversially involves the creation of what are called modal filters, which mostly through bollards, but also through planters and other street furniture, close certain local routes to cars while keeping them open for cyclists and pedestrians. Now, for some, those kinds of measures embodied by Mini Holland as a program were all about reclaiming an urbanizing area on the cusp of inner and outer London for pedestrians, for children, and of course for cyclists. But for others, the measures represented something else. They represented a case of expert rationalities, dismissing the needs of ordinary people who happen to need to drive, or ordinary local businesses who rely on people driving to their premises. So for some, Mini Holland became more than a mere cycling scheme. It became a case study of the ill effects of London's gentrification. And it also came to embody or exemplify increasingly familiar forms of political division. So for example, it embodied divisions between the middle class and the working classes, between elite people and ordinary people, between young people and old people, between people who rely on facts and those who fall back on emotions. So in the research project that I was part of, what we were trying to do when we were studying this case study was to understand how social media platforms were providing a new backdrop for participation in these kinds of controversies around urban change. And we were interested in how, in a very short space of time, really about 10 years or so, social media have become this sort of pervasive and utterly ordinary medium in urban contexts like London. Not just a medium for communicating, but also even just for experiencing the city. So they become kind of backgrounded infrastructures, something that you almost often will just forget, just a way of getting on locally. And it's in that kind of context that social media platforms for us appeared to be supporting what we called a kind of ambient participation around urban transformations. So this is participation that isn't really discrete or clearly directed towards institutions like the planning department of the municipality or to local politicians, but rather a participation that is actually very dispersed, it's incidental, it's very often orientated to the moment. And indeed, as I'll discuss further, often also orientated to particular and often mundane objects. So I just want to spend a couple more minutes on this term ambient. It's a term that's well developed in discussions around media. And it suggests that rather than always thinking about media as communicating messages or as a means for exchanging content, we might also think about how media create atmospheres for communication and exchange. Malcolm McCullough, in his book Ambient Commons, suggests we can see social media as being a kind of ambient, part of what he calls ambient commons. And in the quote on the screen, he draws on the technology critic Lisa Rackelt, who had this notion of ambient intimacy, where she suggested that social media restores a lost kind of awareness or environmental sense found in traditional life, yet one that operates across the necessary distances and at the accelerated pace of the metropolis. Now, in Ambient Commons, McCullough is not primarily interested in social media, but he's more interested in ambient interfaces of pervasive computing. So a good example would just be mobile technologies like the smartphones you see a lot of people using at the protest. Now, McCullough's point is that there's been this steady turn in interface design, that there's this turn away from technologies that are meant to be in the foreground and directing a user's attention. So for example, sitting in front of a desktop or laptop computer where all your attention really is directed at the device. And a turn towards interfaces that are designed to work in and with contexts. Smartphones are a very good example of this, where the interface basically becomes backgrounded in a phenomenological sense. So in the project, one of our interpretations of ambient was to say that social media is backgrounded in the same phenomenological sense that McCullough is talking about in general, but also partly because social media is substantially engaged via mobile technologies like smartphones, where you have that interface design, which puts the interface into the background. Now, our research encompassed a few different platforms, but I'd like to point to a few examples here from local Facebook groups in Walthamstow. Facebook exemplified a notable everyday form of social media contribution about the Mini Holland cycling infrastructure scheme. And one central way this emerges is through digital imaging, or what we might call witnessing, often in conjunction with mobile technologies such as smartphones. So I'll just give a few examples. On the screen here on the left, you see an image that's taken from within a moving automobile, where the user is invoking and apparently evidencing one of the common themes we saw in a lot of our research, which by those critical of the Mini Holland scheme, which is that this notion that these seasoned cyclists, they don't even use this new infrastructure that's being built. See, the cyclist is just riding on the road. They're not even using the bike lane. In the center, we have a contributor who's not critical of the scheme. They're more sympathetic to it. And they just notice some construction barriers, and they use images to ask open-ended and pretty banal questions, really, about just what's going on. And on the right, we have someone who, from our research, we know was a proponent of the scheme, and they're also a Facebook group administrator, and I actually did a separate project just looking at Facebook group administrators, which I can speak more about in the questions if you like. But in this particular example, they're using an image of commissioned street art to call attention to and even celebrate a recent addition made possible by the Mini Holland scheme. Now, the first example that I cited on the previous slide embodies one common act in which comment threads around the Mini Holland project were often instigated. And this is through some variety of what we might call venting. So this is, in other words, users on social media expressing how they feel, and in so doing, maybe releasing some pressure they have. Now, venting broadly related to the Mini Holland project could be about a range of things. So for example, it could be about bad drivers. They could be venting about inconsiderate cyclists, or venting about congestion, road congestion on the school run. But without question, the most common was just about traffic delays, often witnessed with images like you see there of traffic queues and the invocation of a term called road chaos. People would say, more road chaos. Actually, so common was the invocation of road chaos that it often seemed to catalyze various strands of humoristic riffing. So often other users would make a parody of the users that would blame Mini Holland for all kinds of happenings by blaming it for things that had nothing to do with traffic. For example, the weather or the construction of a mobile phone mast. It was because Mini Holland caused that. Or maybe more plausibly, the lateness of a supermarket food delivery. Now, one of the more emotionally laden topics related to the Mini Holland project was the fairly widespread claim that the changes that it was bringing about would prevent emergency vehicles from reaching certain areas. Notably, the modal filters being constructed would prevent emergency vehicles from reaching certain areas. You might recall that protesters' sign I mentioned earlier, which read, "Don't get old, ill, or have a fire. No one can get to you." I've got a video here, but I don't think the sound's going to play, but I'll play it in.
So this is fire engine trying to get through to Mini Holland. Yep, lovely.
So you may or may not have been able to hear that, but in case you didn't, what the user is basically doing is they're taking a video of a fire engine where the construction workers are having to remove the barriers in order to let the fire engine in. And this is a construction site where they're actually adding the modal filters into one of the streets in Walthamstow. So the protesters, sort of using this as, or not protester, but the user is using this as evidence of, look, this is an example of how, these emergency vehicles are not going to be able to get into these areas. Now that contribution that I just outlined, it invokes a certain kind of liveness, like, they're covering something happening right then on the scene. But one of the things we've noticed in the research we did was that there's actually a kind of asynchronicity in these sorts of social media contributions. So, we have the user holding the camera into portrait mode, walking left to right, following this fire truck as it navigates its way past the construction barriers, and they sort of are narrating and evaluating and making judgments upon the situation as it goes. But then they, of course, take the video, they upload it to Facebook, and then they elaborate it further, as you can see, with textual commentary. Then, after they make the post with their textual commentary, that marks the start of a thread on a Facebook group, which is called Walthamstow Residents News. Now, Walthamstow Residents News was for some time one of the largest Facebook groups in the area, and it also tended to host the most critical discussions of this Mini Holland project. And as you might see from comments on the right, the post attracts a series of emotive affirmations from others. So people are saying things like, "This is disgraceful. Life doesn't matter. Every single day there are chaos and accidents. This ain't the first time. What a piss take. And our councillors and politicians don't live in the real world." Now, this is what the entire thread looks like for that particular post. In total, there's 111 comments after that post, organized into nested threads. If we were to measure this according to clock time, from the initial post to the last comment, we're looking at a set of exchanges spread across nearly 2 days or 48 hours, 2,900 minutes. Now, threads like this were actually one of our central research objects because they're a kind of format of public exchange, right? Like they organize and invite contributions in a way that is both extensive but also recursive. So you can say a lot in Facebook threads, unlike, say, Twitter. And also you can just keep coming back and back and back at it, as many users do in this thread. So they kind of have what we saw as a mundane rhythm to them. And for us, they create a kind of environment for a real-time-like experience of urban change. Esther Weltevred and others have suggested that real-timeness is a key feature of what it is like to experience conversations on many social platforms. And when they say real-timeness, what they're not saying is that there's actually a correspondence between events unfolding in the platform environment and then objective clock time. No, what they're saying is that real-timeness is like an experiential condition. One that is, as the quote says on the screen, fabricated through and imminent to platforms, engines, and their cultures. So in other words, the way social media works may not actually be in real time, but because it has that kind of affect or feel, it encourages certain kinds of conversations. These might be conversations that have a capacity for the degree of, sort of measured and deliberative contributions, but it also has a capacity for impulsive and reactionary ones, right? Because people are contributing in the moment. So it turns out that mini Holland, as this sort of urban sustainability or urban sustainable transport policy controversy, a controversy that plays out so notably on these neighborhood social media groups, was neither short-lived nor particularly localized. So later on, during the significant travel and mobility restrictions that went along with the COVID-19 pandemic, the UK government pumped £250 million into an emergency travel fund. And what the government did in this fund was they made it very unambiguous or very clear to local authorities that they wanted this money to be spent quickly. And many local authorities in the UK and in London specifically just did just that. So within a very short space of time, actually 2/3 of the Greater London's 32 boroughs implemented these new low traffic neighborhoods, similar schemes to what we see in mini Holland, which came to be known as LTNs. And LTNs were brought in very different circumstances to mini Holland during the drastic measures that go hand in hand with everything that happened during COVID. But it did not take long for them to earn very similar kinds of controversy, as we see in the mini Holland case. So online, on, again, Facebook neighborhood groups, but also in WhatsApp groups, for example, which had grown in prominence during COVID-19, there was the same kinds of polarized reaction around their implementation. And offline, actually, there was also protests and even guerrilla tactics. So, for example, many influential, even politicians, were encouraging people to go and destroy modal filters or to go and spray paint over the cameras that would monitor the whether traffic was breaching some of the low traffic neighborhood restrictions. Anoush Chakelian, who's the Britain editor of the left-leaning New Statesman magazine in Britain, notably observed that via these low traffic neighborhoods, London streets were becoming a new theater in the so-called culture wars. And in very similar way to Waltham Forest, LTNs for some people were all about improving air quality, improving or encouraging active living, improving safety for children, these sorts of things. But for others, they were associated with what many people call green gentrification, or even a kind of social cleansing. And one of the outcomes of this, this sort of culture war conversation has been LTNs featuring also within a range of conspiracy theories. Theories about what the intent might really be with these sort of urban sustainability policy interventions. So the 15-minute city is a good example, probably the one that's earned the most conspiracy theorizing. This was previously this really anodyne idea that was mainly discussed amongst professional urban planners and transport engineers, has now become framed as, in many corners at least, as a kind of greenwashed, cynical attempt at tyrannical control. It's like described sometimes as an internationalist ploy, perhaps emanating from the UN, to keep people cooped up in ring-fenced 15-minute walkable containers, a stage for a new kind of Hunger Games that will just kick into action at the next inevitable pandemic. Polarized politics and occasionally these sorts of conspiracy theories have also carried into the strife surrounding London Mayor Sadiq Khan's extension of his ultra-low emission zone. The ultra-low emission zone in London was recently extended across the entirety of Greater London. This is an area of around 8 million people. And that was explicitly promised by Sadiq Khan in his election campaign in the last election. And what ULEZ is it's a system that uses ubiquitous cameras and a vehicle database to determine whether vehicles meet strict emission standards or whether the vehicle is exempt from those standards. But if you're not exempt or if the vehicle doesn't meet those standards, the ULEZ involves levying a steep daily charge of £12.50 to drive within the zone. Now, these controversies about LTNs, about 15-minute cities, and most notably about this ULEZ of Sadiq Khan eventually led to the national stage in the UK at a by-election in July 2023. This by-election or special election was held in the parliamentary constituency of Uxbridge and South Ruislip. And it was called because of the resignation of former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who held this seat. And as a reminder, you may not, or maybe not a reminder, maybe to let you know, Boris Johnson was previously, as I mentioned earlier, he was the London mayor. And when he was London mayor, he was actually strongly promoted with the promotion of cycling. He had his Boris bikes, he had his Mini Holland program. The Conservative candidate you see on the screen there, Steve Tuckwell, very narrowly defeated the Labour candidate by less than 2 percentage points. And he fought his campaign on, and he attributed his victory to the apparent unpopularity of Sadiq Khan's ULEZ and its expansion into the borough of Hillingdon, where his constituency sits. And after this election, the Conservative Party clearly decided to take sustainable urban transport issues as a potential political wedge issue. So it's very likely that in the year ahead, in the general election that's probably going to be called this year, the Conservatives will use these sorts of policies in local areas as a possible way to differentiate themselves from the Labour Party, which looks very likely to win the next election. The Labour Party does. Now, sustainable urban transport issues are also certain to feature in the London mayoral elections this coming May 2024. The Conservative Party has chosen someone called Susan Hall as their candidate. And she's a politician who has not only made her no secret of her appreciation of Donald Trump, but also she's a politician who has made reversing Sadiq Khan's ULEZ expansion a key part of her campaign. And even she has some curious related ideas, such as any remaining 4x4 vehicles that are non-compliant will be purchased by the Greater London Authority somehow and sent to Ukraine in support of the war effort. Now, it's important, though, to not get too caught up with consoling ourselves that we're dealing simply with a bunch of misguided reactionary conspiracy theories or reactionary politics about sustainable urban transport here. In the case study I mentioned earlier about Mini Holland, it is true that there was misinformation and conspiracy theories present, and it's true in many of the other LTNs that have emerged since, that you have that kind of discourses happening. But it's also the case that people circulating misinformation, for instance, are often doing so based on perhaps understandable feelings of displacement, of feeling like they've been left behind in a rapidly changing and increasingly expensive part of East London. And it's also important here to consider the changing status of cycling and pedestrianization in planning debates. It's no longer really on the margins, right? There's been a notable turning of the tide, perhaps, at least in many contexts. Things are different than they were in the 1960s, for instance, and throughout much of the late 20th century, when you had someone like Jane Jacobs, who's shown there on the screen, notably advocating for urban quality of life, walkability, generally localness, and arguing against the strong ideals of metropolitan automobility that were cherished at the time by professional engineers and urban planners in cities like New York or Toronto. Jane Jacobs' ideas have arguably become actually mainstream now. Many cities formerly dominated by car culture are now replete with examples of built environment improvements being made in favor of pedestrians, being made in favor of cyclists, or just in generally being made in favor of convivial public congregation. But the question to ask here is, does this mean communities and environmentalists have won the day? Well, perhaps, but scholars like John Stalin in his book Cyclescapes of the Unequal City tend to sound a more cautionary tone about this. So Stalin, for example, takes his readers to the case study of Valencia Street, which is in the Mission District of San Francisco. And Stalin gives us an example of Valencia Street being the sort of epicenter of a very long-fought struggle for better cycling infrastructure, which came out of actually quite radical social movements like Critical Mass, and then later the San Francisco Bicycling Coalition. But by the late 1990s, began to make inroads for what was called a road diet on Valencia Street, where they removed some of the car lanes and created new cycling lanes in the area. But the thing is, what Stalin points out is that even though this came from a much more radical kind of cycling anti-car movement, it actually flourishes eventually by the 1990s and into the present in a very different context. A context where policymakers are actually strongly in favor of cycling, not just because of its environmental merits, but because of its relationship to perceived connection with higher property values, with the revitalization of business districts, with the cultivation of a healthy workforce, and so on. And so for Stalin, Valencia Street isn't just an example of the tide turning against automobility, but it is an example of the tide turning against automobility, but it's not just because of a celebration or an advancement of environmental thinking, but actually it's a new kind of urban policy approach, which Stalin describes as sort of tactical urbanism or urban acupuncture. So those are like these light touch, small scale interventions by municipal authorities that are just politically expedient, financially affordable, often led as much by citizen experts as they are by the government. Drawing on Michel de Certeau, Stalin says this is a process in which the tactics of activists have somehow become the strategies of the state. So Stalin's giving us a story where cycling infrastructure is not necessarily an unquestioned public good. Valencia Street and the Mission District are also epicenters of gentrification in San Francisco. And like in many other cities, the implementation of cycling infrastructure in this area has been resisted by some residents, not because they're opposed to urban sustainability policy, but because their cycling has become closely associated with wealthy incomers. And that kind of resistance has been something of a surprise to urban policymakers, as well as cycling advocates. A surprise in San Francisco, but also it was very much a surprise in the case I described earlier in Walthamstow, East London. I think no one was just thinking there was going to be such resistance to these kinds of policies. So in this way, Stalin and others like him seem to be saying that we're seeing in examples like Valencia Street in San Francisco, a kind of process that aligns as much with the views of someone like Richard Florida as they do with Jane Jacobs. So, Jane Jacobs was very much concerned about urban economies, but with Florida, this is an unequivocal reason for pursuing so-called progressive or environmental policies. He's an urban thinker that's become famous for reframing interventions such as cycling infrastructure as first and foremost a means for cities to attract economically, socially, and geographically mobile professionals, educated workers, even high-tech employers. Now, it's worth just pointing out that Stalin situates his analysis in a larger explanatory framework, which we might see as broadly Marxist, or at least making heavy nods to theories of capitalism. So for the politics of cycling for Stalin are about transformations under post-polarized urban capitalism, in which urban place has become more valuable than traffic flow, I guess. And he talks about how cycling infrastructure, it obviously has use values. It makes the city more amenable and accessible to particular forms of mobility, but also those use values can be converted into exchange values in the form of prices for land and housing, as well as financial returns for business enterprises. Now, Stalin falls back on those broader explanations, but another thing I'd like to notice, and I'm sort of moving towards the end here, I know I'm at 35 minutes, but Stalin's case study very much also revolves around looking at how politics crops up around very particular kinds of material interventions in cities. So in other words, what's controversial in sustainable urban transport interventions are quite specific, often material objects, things like the modal filters that I mentioned earlier, or even more specifically, things like bollards or planters or street furniture. So drawing on ideas from scholars like Bruno Latour or Jane Bennett, one thing we might note is that these aren't just objects of public discourse. They're not just things people talk about. They're also things or objects that in their sort of sheer urban materiality do things. They have particular consequences. They affect mobilities. They perhaps restructure or reshape infrastructural arrangements. They have consequences that are sometimes anticipated. So for instance, in the case of modal filters, obviously planners and engineers have certain aspirations and expectations of what implementing these will do at particular locations. But the consequences of these kinds of material objects are actually also unpredictable. They're very much contingent on the flow and experience of everyday urban life, its encounters, its varied and unequal conditions, and the way that people make different interpretations of these sorts of objects. So this way of thinking about political controversies is at the center of the book Controversy Mapping, a Field Guide. And one of the most important ideas this book puts forward is that while controversies can stem from debates around abstract ideas, abstract ideologies, public controversies rarely revolve around those sorts of things. But instead, and this is very much drawing on the work of science and technology studies scholars like Nurture Maris, the claim made in this book is that politics is by and large object-orientated, or it's issue-orientated at least. So people, or we might say publics, tend to dispute much more concrete matters of concern rather than sort of general ideas. And what's more, any given controversy is rarely about just one issue. Rather, a controversy is usually made up of multiple intersecting issues. So even if it's important that we do attain broad consensus around the need for, say, strategies around urban sustainability or sustainable transportation, on the ground, both experts and non-experts alike are much more prone to be focusing on particular implementations of these kinds of policies. Okay, so just to bring things to a close, in the year ahead, one of the things that I'm working towards is trying to work through some of these principles that I've just discussed around controversy mapping, but in relation to a larger kind of case study, which is the broader circulation of online misinformation around sustainable urban transport. So, for example, things like the LTNs and ULEZ 50-minute cities. And there's a couple of reasons I want to do that this year. First, as I've described earlier, the UK is almost certain to have a general election in 2024 in which sustainable transport may be a prominent issue, although probably mainly in particular locations. And also, of course, the London mayoral elections, in which will definitely include some discussion of these kinds of issues. The second reason is actually just more mundane and related to my own working conditions. But it so happens that this year I received, with my colleague Robert Topinka, a small British Academy grant focused on blending qualitative and quantitative approaches to online misinformation. And the heart of that project is a recognition about the limitations of the way most research has tended to approach misinformation, which is usually to do things like stressing processes of fact checking or content moderation, or doing building big data driven models to monitor misinformation content. While those approaches all have value, the problem they have is that they tend to overlook, why do people engage with misinformation in the first place? And how might that be connected to their everyday social media habits? So one of the things we're doing in the project is we're going to be running 2 intensive methods workshops in the next couple of months, actually, focusing on experimenting with different mixed method approaches to researching misinformation on social media. And the workshops will be anchored to pilot projects around different genres of misinformation. So we'll be looking at things like immigration, COVID or vaccine skepticism, climate denialism, and probably something around sustainable urban transport issues. And so in the pilot project, I'm hoping to trial some of these processes, but there'll be 3 really challenging things. The first is that one of the things which we aspire to in researching misinformation is to try and move nimbly across different social media platforms. So in other words, not to just choose one platform and just look at how misinformation circulates on one platform. But the problem with that is that the current approaches that there are out there to doing cross-platform analysis, people like Richard Rodgers, for example, talk about cross-platform analysis. It really tends to focus on just tracking how content moves across platforms, rather than looking at how people experience in their everyday experience will maybe themselves move nimbly across different platforms. So that's the first problem. Second problem is that while we're interested in blending qualitative and quantitative approaches, doing that in a way on a large-scale study, doing it in a way that's practically achievable is very difficult. In the Mini Holland case study I was talking about earlier, we were combining quite different types of methods. So we were on the one hand doing sort of natural language processing, but then on the other, we were doing sort of in-depth interviews. And that worked in a small project, but in a larger scale study, the mixing of qualitative and quantitative techniques will need to be more strategic, more focused, and they'll probably need to be in closer proximity. And I can talk a bit about that. Final thing is just that the key thing a key element that's relevant to studying misinformation around sustainable urban transport specifically is that we're often looking at very local issues that are very local and object oriented, as I mentioned earlier. But it's hard to delve into that kind of analysis from a very large data set. So one of the things we're going to need to figure out is how to localize some of these controversies. And it is true that sometimes people geotag their contributions on social media, so you can actually look at where these conversations are happening, but that's actually quite rare. And so it's more likely we're going to need to find other ways, qualitative ways, to home in on the local nature of these controversies and undertake these sort of carefully sampled local case studies. Now, I've outlined these challenges. They are my challenges. They are not your challenges, but I'd be very interested in any thoughts you might have about them, how we might respond to them. But of course, I'd be very happy just to discuss any themes that you think are interesting or something you might want to question about everything I've presented to you in the past 40 minutes or so. Sorry for going over time, but thanks. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very, very much, Scott. It was really a pleasure to follow your presentation, to follow your argument. Indeed, we're a little bit over time. We have a bit more than 10 minutes for like 12 minutes for questions and comments. Just a couple of words about the format. People in the room, either come and join me at this desk if you want to ask a question, or if it's more comfortable to ask from your seat, please do. And if it's not really understandable for Scott, I'll just repeat it. People on Zoom and on Facebook, please write your questions to the chat. People on Zoom, you could raise hand or type a Q letter if you would like to show your face and ask the question. I think the presentation was super interesting, both as very kind of intriguing case studies to scrutinize. I would just mention that in Vilnius, where we host this webinar last year, there were mayoral elections, and actually the issue of narrowing the streets was the core one. Just it was not really polarized. It was very much a consensus that narrowing the roads to give more space to cyclists and pedestrians was a planning mistake, which should be reversed somehow. So you had to be really extravagant as a candidate for a mayor to actually back that idea that narrowing roads was a good one. So from this perspective, it would be already very interesting to start this conversation. And also, of course, the presentation was super interesting on this conceptual level, which I hope we have time to discuss. As for this first note that I made, maybe Scott, you could say to what, because sometimes you sounded like those camps in these polarized conversations, they're somehow extension or could be considered as extensions of party politics. Is it really can we say so? Or much more nuanced, of course.
Yeah, no, it's more nuanced. I think in the particular case of the UK, the Conservatives have opportunistically, gone in on this issue and reframed it as, kind of in the same category as, anti-woke politics in general. Like, I mean, it's kind of incoherent actually, but it's I mean, being slightly cynical, I think this is not just me saying this. I mean, most of the political commentariat in the UK are pointing out that the Conservatives do look a little bit desperate right now. And so they're sort of looking for any way they can shore up a vote. So, but I think it's not really party political. Otherwise, the Conservative Party is making it party political. But in the case of the Mini Holland, for example, the Mini Holland case, some of the people who were protesting against it would be probably considered on the left otherwise. Like there were some people who were like sort of labor trade union activists, but they just didn't like, they opposing these changes because, a lot of the people who were opposed to them in the case of Mini Holland were, actually, I would say the majority of the people were working class people who would be described broadly as working class. And the people who are generally supportive tended to be middle class professionals. So, there's a class dimension probably, but it doesn't straightforwardly reflect onto the party political divides.
Super. So questions from the seminar room or from Zoom colleagues? I'll check Facebook also. Yeah. Oh yeah, here. So perhaps I could ask a follow-up question, like coming from this political dimension that we just started to exchange on. I think this notion of ambient participation is super interesting that you introduced. I wonder if it is this participation political? You framed it phenomenologically in many ways, but do you have any notion of politics that somehow makes this ambient participation notion operational, like work somehow? Do you have any notion of politics in mind that would match with this?
It's a really good question. I feel that this is one of the elements of that earlier case study, we had a pretty good, we developed a very, I think, good conceptualization of ambient participation, but the kind of kind of connecting that to political theory, say, and like sort of thinking, well, what is that actually? How does that relate? It's less clear. Although I think, I mean, one response to that would be that in some ways, on one level, it's not that different than other types of ambient participation people might have had in the past pre-social media, like where people just had these sort of conversations about things that had political remit, but they just had it in a way that was sort of just, in a cafe, and it was just like a conversation. Those sorts of things, usually political theory accounts for those as like, those are like kind of like the base conditions for people's understanding, which then they go into more formal political venues and take action through organizing or through voting and these sorts of things, or journalists write about them in a way that's more reflective. So in some ways you could say social media is like that, although on the other hand, the difference is that social media platforms, especially Facebook, is archiving these things so that when you have these conversations and threads, people are able to look back at what people said before and literally even cut and paste and say, you said this, and I don't think, and so it's a very different dynamic. There's different structural affordances with Facebook than there is in a conversation. So I think what I would say is that there are some similarities with the kind of like, it's just the grounds of sort of people's understanding of what issues are, and it doesn't directly, it's hard to directly mobilize that into participation in politics in a formal sense. And most local authorities, at least the ones we've looked at, ignore these kinds of conversations online because it's just too much, there's too much noise and it's just hard to get their heads around it. But on the other hand, because there is a degree of archiving and there's there's a structuring of these conversations that's different than ephemeral conversations. I think it's closer to being mobilized into formal politics because local authorities maybe are monitoring it to some extent, for example, and like, journalists can go and look and see what's online and then write stories about it in a way that you couldn't. So it's sort of almost halfway between informal, ephemeral conversations and then more formal politics. I'm not sure that really answers the question, but it's something that I feel that is one of these things that we need to do a little bit more theorizing around, actually, to sort of really properly connect it to political theory.
Now I'm rather surprised that you started to talk about narrative, first of all, about what people kind of say, not what people photograph or record and then post, because this I thought about it first of all from perspective of this kind of conflicting user experience stances or conflicting user experience, I don't know, conflicting articulations of user experience, somehow user experience of a driver, of a cyclist, of a pedestrian. Like, also what surprised me that usually, I guess most of the videos and photos that you refer to, they were taken by people who walk, perhaps because there you just cannot drive simply, but like on those areas. And I just wonder to what extent this kind of user experience is politicized.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's what you see in a lot of the threads is someone, well, in many of the threads is that someone will take a photo of something, or a video or a photo, sometimes quite, well, you might say innocently, like they just want to share something, but that will become like the evidence or the object of like a huge, like a debate, a big debate. I had another, in our data set, we had another example where someone just took a photo and said, wow, I'm really enjoying sitting outside on the street, and these construction barriers are going to make the street better. So they had a little bit of an evaluation, but it was pretty much just a photo of a street, and it's led to this huge, huge sort of debate. So I guess in a sense, it is politicizing user experience, and I think that's one of the things that that's one of the reasons why we found Facebook so interesting, because that's the platform where people are most likely around these sorts of issues anyways to share experience, because it's sort of like the platform's geared around that. Like, so people think, oh, I saw this, I'm curious about this, right? And it'll just say something about it. Whereas on Twitter, users are less likely to do that. That people on Twitter are more likely a cycling advocate, and they're posting a report and they're saying this, this report says this, this, and this is why we need to, promote sustainable transport. And, it becomes much more overtly politicized on Twitter, whereas, or at least it did before. I'm not sure whether that's quite the same now. But on Facebook, I mean, that you do definitely have a politics of surrounding pretty banal, everyday kinds of witnessing, or like people just sharing things without necessarily intending it for it to be highly political, but it becomes political.
Super, thanks a lot. And we have, I guess, literally a couple of minutes. So perhaps if you have question or comment, it's the last chat, because I have many more, obviously, and I can go on. But please do. I think nothing on Facebook yet. And here in the room. I think, like, for me, it's also super interesting to think about the case from perspective of discussions on decarbonization and in particular the relations between fossil fuels and democracy, or fossil fuels and liberty, somehow how modern democratic societies were built around fossil fuels, and like what do we witness here? Like, is it like that? Does it destabilize then our notions of democracy, of liberty, etc.? So, like, of course, it's easy to frame like those conspiracies related to 15-minute cities as crazy, yes, but if to look like at it from broader perspective, I think it's super interesting to think about what was indeed the share of fossil fuels in building democratic, I don't know, experience. Maybe again, it's not like democratic institutions, but experience of liberty, of freedom, whatever. I wonder if this trend is mattering for you as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, definitely I think we expect to hope, I think we would see that in the research I'm proposing to do, but just even in the case study of Mini Holland, a lot of the people on social media critical of the scheme, part of the articulation is for them is often about these newcomers into the area are professionals. They take the tube, the metro, into London. They maybe have a car, but they don't depend on it for work. Whereas I've worked really hard, and there's one narrative is about more, I need it for my job, but the other one is just, I've worked really hard, and this is part of, like, the kind of autonomy I've been able to achieve. And now someone who doesn't need a car in the same way is telling me I can't drive the car. And I guess, one way to look at that, I think, is that there's these underlying conditions in which the kind of society that the UK is, like, I'll just speak to the UK for now, is one where, fossil fuels have created a particular kind of conditions of possibility for, like, freedom. And for a lot of people, even it's almost like a kind of a disavowal, because I think a lot of these people probably know very well that it's not, that I don't even think these are necessarily people who are denying climate change, but they know that this is like a problem. But on the other hand, this is part of how, like, this is part of their autonomy. Even, I mean, in some cases, identity too. Like, that the part of their identity is the kind of car they have, and who they are is very much associated with that. And so I think you're right that there is something deep seated there, and I think that's why I don't think it's necessarily all that misguided for the Conservative Party to think there might be some electoral kind of, like, value in that, even though it goes against, I mean, it actually under Boris Johnson, the UK was one of the leaders in making climate change commitments, but under the Conservatives now, I mean, in many ways people say, oh, they're not as crazy as it was under Boris Johnson, but one change is that the current party is actually climbing down from a lot of those commitments because they think that this might be a vote winner somehow, right? And I think there is something there about people's ideas about freedom and liberty, and that, it's not just about the democracy isn't just about consensus around decisions. It's about being autonomous and being free, and these sort of more general ideas, which are they're very closely connected, I think, to the economies we've created, the energy economy we still live within very much. So
then it would be fantastic to follow your work. So thank you very, very much again for joining. I would just say that Scott has mentioned the project on misinformation in everyday life, which I hope might create a ground for us to cooperate in the future. So those of the audience who are interested, please get in touch with Laboratory of Critical Urbanism, and yeah, we'll make sure you can follow that work as well. So, but for today, Scott, thanks a lot, and yeah, and thank you everyone who joined this, both here in the class and online. And let's stay in touch then.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the question, Siarhei.
Bye then.
Bye.